On the fourth night of my marriage, the wedding quilt was still folded at the foot of the bed, its corners squared the way my mother-in-law had left them. My husband's pillow held a cold indent where his head had rested for maybe 40 minutes. His coat, hanging by the side door instead of the front, carried the smell of barn air and lantern oil. At 9:40 exactly, he had kissed my forehead, whispered that he would be back before I woke, and stepped outside carrying a small tin pail he told me was empty. I lay very still, listening to gravel under his boots, and I moved the lantern on the sill 1 inch. My name, for the purpose of telling this, is Christina. I was 19 that autumn, a middle daughter from a plain settlement my new husband's district considered too small to matter. If you are the kind of viewer who prefers slow, careful stories about women who learned to trust their own eyes before they trusted anyone else's word, please stay with me and subscribe, because this channel is built for exactly that patience. A gentle like helps quiet stories like this one find the people who need them. And somewhere in the comments when the video ends, I want to ask you a very specific question, not about pain, but about noticing. Now let me walk you back to that lantern. That 1 inch mattered more than I understood. Before I moved it, the flame lit only the wash basin and the corner of the trunk that still held my folded aprons. After I moved it, the light reached past the sill, across the porch boards, and down the first bend of the lane. From the bed, if I turned my head just so, I could see the small dark path he took. Not the front road, which any neighbor might walk, but the narrow trail that curved behind the orchard, past the smokehouse, out toward a stand of pines I had not yet been shown. Older women in his family called that stretch of ground the back way. No one explained why it needed a name. I was not a suspicious girl. I had grown up believing that a husband's evenings were a husband's own, especially in a first year of marriage, when a young wife was expected to settle her hands and let the household teach her its rhythm. My mother had said it plainly the morning of the wedding, brushing lint off my sleeve as if brushing off my questions. Settle in before you notice things. At the time I heard tenderness in it. Later I would understand it as an instruction. She had known that noticing, in that house, was the first small door that could not be closed again. The room I slept in was on the east side of my husband's family farm, upstairs, with a window that opened over the vegetable garden. My husband, whose name I will simply say was Amish, had grown up in that same room. His mother had kept the walls whitewashed and the floor scrubbed to a pale, tired shine. There was a marriage chest at the foot of the bed with my initials burned into the lid, and inside it, beneath linens I had stitched myself, sat the wedding quilt his aunt had gifted us. On our wedding night, she had folded it at the foot of the mattress. On the second night, I had left it there. On the third night, I noticed his mother had refolded it in exactly the same shape while I was outside feeding chickens. I want to be careful how I describe those first 4 nights, because I do not want anyone to imagine something they should not. What happened between us was quiet and small, and mostly nothing. Amish was gentle in the way a boy is gentle, when he has been told all his life that gentleness is the safest form of restraint. He would sit on the edge of the bed and take off his boots one at a time and place them side by side and ask me if I had eaten enough at supper. He would put out the lamp, he would lie on top of the covers, not under them, and near 9:40 he would rise, put his boots back on, and leave through the side door with a pail he claimed was empty. That side door was another detail I did not read correctly. Our farmhouse had 2 entrances. A front door that opened onto the road, where neighbors and church members and delivery drivers all came, and a side door off the kitchen that faced the orchard and the pines. In the district he had grown up in, respectable men used the front. Errands, chores, courtship visits, funerals, Sunday travel, everything worthy of daylight went through the front. The side door was for hauling wash water, for shaking rugs, for slipping out to the outhouse before dawn. My husband, 4 nights in a row, chose the side door for a walk he could easily have taken through the front. And nobody in the household commented on that choice. which meant nobody in the household was allowed to. On the fourth night, after the lantern was moved and the gravel had gone quiet, I lay awake and did math I did not want to do. 9:40 was not the time a man walks off an argument, because we had not argued. It was not the time a man goes to check a sick animal, because the barn light never came on. It was not the hour of a prayer meeting, because we were newly married and no man leaves a new wife at prayer hour without saying so. It was a scheduled time. That was what my body understood before my mind did. My husband was not slipping away. He was reporting somewhere, and whoever kept that schedule had built it before I ever arrived in this house. I remember the first honest question I asked myself, whispered into the pillow so softly that even the walls could pretend not to hear. If he is going to the same place at the same minute every night, then who else in this family already knows where that place is? Because a secret one man keeps is a secret. A schedule several people protect is an arrangement. I did not have language yet for the difference between those two words. I only had the folded quilt, the moved lantern, the smell of barn air on the wrong coat, and the memory of a cousin at the wedding who had leaned close to my ear during the meal and murmured, "Don't count the nights. It only makes it worse." I had smiled at her then, the way brides smile at everyone. I did not understand until much later that she had been trying to give me the only warning she was allowed to give in a room full of witnesses. That night, alone in the bed my mother-in-law had made, I began to count anyway. 4 nights, 4 departures, 1 pail he swore was empty, 1 lantern moved an inch, 1 narrow path around an orchard I had not yet walked in daylight, and somewhere at the end of that path, invisible from the road, someone was waiting for my husband to arrive on time, someone whose existence, I would learn, had required a wedding to remain hidden. I was born in a settlement called Willow Bend, though on maps it barely qualifies as a name. My father farmed 40 acres of tired soil, 2 counties east of where I would eventually marry, and my mother raised 7 of us on bread, patience, and the kind of thrift that turns flour sacks into pillowcases. I was the 4th child and the 2nd daughter, which meant I was neither the one watched most closely nor the one indulged most warmly. I learned early to read a room by the position of my mother's shoulders. If they were high, someone was in trouble. If they were low, someone was about to be. That skill would matter later, in a kitchen that was not hers. Our district in Willow Bend was small, plain, and known for being unremarkable. We had 1 bishop, 2 ministers, and a deacon, who was also our best carpenter. Marriages inside our settlement usually happened between families who had known each other for 3 generations. So when Amos's mother came to visit us that spring, driven by an older cousin in a hired van because their district was too far for a buggy, my mother behaved as if a bishop's wife had arrived. She used the good tea. She brought out the plate we saved for funerals. She sat straighter than she sat in church. I noticed all of it, and I did not yet know how to be suspicious of my own mother's posture. Amos and I had met only twice before that visit, both times at a wedding on neutral ground, a shared cousin marrying into a district that lay between ours and his. He was tall and quiet, the kind of young man who listens more than he speaks, and answers questions with a nod when a nod will do. I liked him for that. In a settlement where boys competed to be the loudest at singings, his silence felt like respect. What I did not know then was that some silences are trained, some are simply a person's nature, and some are a person carrying a weight he has been told he must never set down in front of a stranger. Our courtship lasted 4 months, which even my sisters thought was fast. His family sent word that they hoped for a harvest wedding because there was extra work coming in on their farm that winter, and Amos would need a wife's help settling the household before the snow. That reason satisfied everyone at our table. It did not satisfy me entirely, but I was 19 and in love with the idea of being chosen by a family who owned 2 barns instead of 1. My father asked one question during the negotiation. I heard him through the kitchen wall, and my mother answered before Amos's mother could. "We trust them," she said. That is enough. I did not hear my father speak again on the subject. The wedding itself was small by their district standards and large by ours. 3 long tables in a scrubbed white barn, celery in tall jars down the middle, the smell of roast chicken and warm bread and starched cotton. His aunt, the widowed one, the one who managed the family's shared property, sat at the head of the women's table and watched me the way an accountant watches a new column of figures. His mother squeezed my hand under the tablecloth twice, both times exactly when a certain older man across the room looked toward us. I mistook her squeezes for affection. In truth, she was steadying herself. I was the piece of the plan that had finally arrived on time. From the outside, the marriage looked like a quiet success. Our districts have a way of speaking about young couples in a shorthand meant to bless them and warn them at once. A good boy who finally settled. A girl lucky to be chosen. I heard both sentences within the first week, spoken by different women at different produce stands, delivered in tones that were kind on the surface and instructive underneath. Inside the house, the picture was thinner than it looked. Meals were on time, chores were divided, prayers were said, but information moved in only one direction, from Amos's mother and aunt down to me, and any question I asked in return was answered with a smile and a change of subject. I had no buggy of my own. My clothes were still in trunks. My small savings had been placed in a tin box that Amos's mother kept in the pantry, for safekeeping, she said, until I learned the household. I could not write to my mother without borrowing paper from the drawer in the sitting room, and the drawer was in a room where someone was almost always present. Everything I had brought with me from Willow Bend now depended on the goodwill of women I had known for 4 months. That is what dependence looks like in a plain house. Not chains, just doors you cannot open without asking, and questions you cannot ask without being watched. The morning after the 4th night, I stood at the kitchen sink and remembered my cousin's whisper at the wedding, "Don't count the nights." She was married into a different branch of the same extended family, and she had held my hand under the table for a full second longer than a bride's cousin usually does. At the time I had thought she was homesick for our settlement. Now I understood she had been trying to tell me that the counting had already started for her, and that once you begin, you cannot make yourself stop. I rinsed the same cup 3 times before I set it down. That evening, at 9:40, I planned to move the lantern back, and then I planned to follow the light instead of watching it leave. The chance came sooner than I planned, and not the way I had rehearsed. On the 5th evening, Amos came through the side door in a hurry to fetch a lamp wick from the pantry, and he set the tin pail on the porch step instead of carrying it with him. I saw it through the kitchen window. He had never once let that pail out of his hand in my presence. He had never once even turned his back to it, but the lamp had guttered in the sitting room where his mother was mending, and she had called for him twice, and for a single distracted minute, the pail sat alone in the dusk on a board I had swept that morning. I went out through the kitchen door with a dish towel in my hand, the way any wife might, and I bent beside the pail as if I were brushing something off the step. The lid was a plain tin lid with a small crimp on one edge where it had been pried open too many times. I lifted it 1/2 inch. I did not tip it. I did not touch what was inside. I only looked. There was a folded square of white cloth, thicker than a handkerchief. There was a small dark jar with a wax seal, and there was a ring of 3 keys tied together with a piece of black bootlace, none of them the shape of any lock I had used in that house. I set the lid back down, straightened, and walked to the clothesline as if that had been my errand all along. My hands were steady, my knees were not. I unpinned 2 towels I did not need and folded them slowly against my apron, because folding is what a woman does with her hands when she needs her face to stop showing what her mind has just seen. A jar with a wax seal is not a snack a man takes on a walk. A folded white cloth is not a rag for a barn, and 3 keys that do not fit our doors mean there is a 4th door somewhere on this property, and I had not been told about it. Amos came back out of the house before I had reached the porch again. He picked up the pail without looking at me, tested its weight in his hand, the the way a man tests a milk pail to see if his wife has already been to the barn, and gave me a small, ordinary smile. "I will not be long tonight," he said. He had never told me how long he would or would not be. That single sentence, spoken to reassure me, told me instead that he had noticed the towels and the timing and the way I had moved past the step. He kissed my forehead. He walked around the orchard. I stood at the sink and counted his footsteps until I could not hear them anymore. The next morning at breakfast, he asked me if I had slept well. His mother was slicing bread at the counter with her back to us, but her knife stopped moving for the length of his question and started again on the answer. "Yes," I said. "Very well." Amos held my eyes a moment longer than a husband holds his wife's eyes over a plate of eggs, not with anger, not even with suspicion in the ordinary sense. He looked at me the way a man looks at a fence he has just noticed is one rail lower than he thought. Something needed mending, and he would mend it before the day was out. His mother resumed slicing. I asked for more coffee to give my hands something to do. He mended the fence that afternoon, in his own quiet way. When I went upstairs to change my apron before supper, I found that the small cupboard above the wash basin, the one where I had begun keeping my folded prayer cap and a handful of hairpins, now had a hasp on it and a padlock the size of a walnut. He said nothing about it. His mother said nothing about it. I did not ask, because asking would have confirmed that I understood what the lock was for. Instead, I refolded the wedding quilt at the foot of the bed and pulled its corners tighter than his mother ever had, as if smoothing evidence I had not yet gathered. That evening, I lay on top of the covers in my day dress, breathing shallowly, listening for the small sounds a house makes when it thinks no one is listening back. The clock in the sitting room chimed the half hour. Amos's boots crossed the floor downstairs. 1 step, 2 steps, the pause at the coat hook, the 3rd step to the side door. The latch lifted, the gravel began. I waited until the gravel reached the bend where the orchard hid the path, and then I sat up. My heart was not racing. It was doing something steadier and worse. It was accepting a task. I did not follow him all the way that night. I only walked to the end of the porch and stood in my stockings on boards that were still warm from the day's sun. I could see, at the far edge of the orchard, the very small orange dot of his lantern, moving slow and even, the way a lantern moves when a man is not in a hurry and not being followed. Then the orange dot turned left, where I had assumed the path turned right, and disappeared behind a windbreak of pines I had never walked past. It did not come back into view. I stood there for a long time, memorizing the exact place the light had gone out. His mother arrived the next morning without warning, carrying 2 jars of pear preserves and a small paper packet of dried mint. She let herself in through the front door this time, calling my name the way an aunt calls a niece she has not seen in a season. It was only 9 in the morning. She had walked from her own house across the field in a clean apron, which meant this was not a chore visit, this was a call. She set the jars on the counter, put water on for tea, and asked me how I was settling. She used the word settling 3 times in the first 2 minutes. I understood then that my mother had used the same word for a reason. She stayed until the middle of the afternoon. She dried dishes I would have dried myself. She refolded a stack of towels I had folded that morning and pretended not to be refolding them. She asked whether Amos had been eating enough at supper, whether he had been sleeping well, whether he seemed tired in the evenings. Each question sounded like tenderness. Each answer I gave was filed somewhere behind her eyes. When she finally left, she paused at the door and said, without turning, "I will come by tomorrow after chores." A young wife should not be alone in a big house so soon. I heard the sentence as generosity. It was a schedule. She kept it. She came the next day, and the day after that, always in the late afternoon, always staying until well past dusk. She helped me boil water for laundry we did not need washed. She insisted on carrying the wash basin up the stairs herself, which meant she saw the new padlock on the small cupboard and did not remark on it, which meant she had already known it would be there. By the end of the first week of visits, I had not been alone in the house between 5 o'clock and 9 o'clock a single evening. The lantern on my sill stayed where she left it, 1 inch to the left of where I had set it. She never mentioned that either. Amos's younger sister came by twice during those visits, ostensibly to borrow a length of black thread. Her name was Lena. She was 17, still in the last soft edge of girlhood, and she had a habit of looking at doors before she looked at faces. Each time the side door opened or closed, even in daylight for an ordinary reason, her eyes flicked toward the sound and away again, before anyone could catch her looking. I caught her once. Her cheeks went pink, and she asked me a question about my Willow Bend sisters that she did not really want the answer to. I understood in that moment that Lena knew something, and that whatever she knew, she had been told not to look at it directly. On market day, I walked the half-mile to the produce stand with Amos's mother beside me, because she said the road was too long for a new wife to walk alone. At the stand, a neighbor woman named Fanny Yoder pressed a jar of chow chow into my hand as a wedding gift and held my fingers a beat too long around the glass. "Your husband is a faithful son," she said, smiling. "His family is fortunate." Fanny was a deacon's wife, and deacons' wives in that district did not compliment new brides on their husbands without meaning something specific. I thanked her. I put the jar in my basket. I did not ask her what kind of faithfulness she meant, because I already suspected the answer. The cost of being watched added up in ways I had not known to expect. I could not write a letter home without borrowing paper from the sitting room drawer while someone was in the room. I could not walk to the mailbox at the end of the lane without Amos's mother offering to walk with me for the exercise. I could not linger by the side door in the evening without her calling me back to the kitchen to help with a task that could have waited until morning. My hours were not filled with cruelty, they were filled with company. That was the trick of it. A woman surrounded by kindness cannot easily say she is being watched. At the small church service that Sunday, held in the Byler family's barn, which had been swept clean for the occasion, a hired girl from the farm 2 properties over refused to meet my eyes during the meal that followed. Her name was Anna. She was maybe 16, thin and quick, the kind of girl who works 4 households a week and hears more than any of them realize. When I passed her the bowl of pickled beets, she took it with both hands and looked at the floor. When I said her name gently, she said, "Thank you, Christina," and moved to the next table. She had spoken to me at the wedding. She would not speak to me now. Something had changed in 3 weeks, and it had not changed in me. That night I sat at the small desk in the sitting room, borrowed paper on the blotter, and wrote a careful letter to my mother in Willow Bend. I did not accuse anyone. I did not ask anything that could not be read aloud at her kitchen table. I only wrote, "Mother, before the wedding, did Amos's mother tell you anything about their family that I should know now that I am here?" I sealed the envelope while Amos's mother was in the pantry counting jars. 4 days later, a reply came, in my mother's small, even hand. "Christina, every family has its own way of doing things. Trust your husband. Trust his people. Write again when you feel more settled." I read the letter twice, folded it into my apron pocket, and understood that my own mother had just chosen a side. The invitation came through Amos, not directly. He told me at breakfast, in the same tone he might have used to mention a change in the weather, that his Aunt Miriam Byler would like me to come for tea that afternoon. I noted the name without reacting. Miriam Byler was his father's older sister, widowed for 9 years, and the woman who held the family's shared property in her name because her late husband had left it to her outright instead of dividing it among his brothers. That detail I had learned from Lena, who mentioned it once while sorting mending, and then looked immediately at the door as if she had said too much. In this family, land and information moved through the same hands. Her house sat at the far side of the same lane, past the orchard, but not as far as the pines. I walked there alone that afternoon, which was itself unusual. Amos's mother did not offer to accompany me, which meant this visit had been arranged above her. Miriam's front room was cooler than the rest of the day, with a low fire burning in the stove even though the air outside was mild. 2 cups of tea were already poured on the small table between 2 chairs. Steam rose from both. She had known the exact minute I would arrive, and she had wanted me to see that she knew. She did not stand when I came in. She only gestured to the chair across from her. She began with kindness. She asked about Willow Bend, about my mother's health, about whether I had settled into the upstairs room. She used my given name 3 times inside 2 minutes, which in that family was a form of gentle authority, the way an older woman reminds a younger one that her name is now spoken in this house too. I answered every question truthfully and briefly. I had learned by then that in a room where 2 cups of tea are poured before you arrive, the shortest answers are the safest. Miriam's hands were small and very still on the table. She had the stillness of a woman who had never needed to raise her voice to be obeyed. Then she began to rename things. She said she had heard I was a little nervous in the evenings, and that new brides sometimes suffered from nerves when their husbands were called out for family duties. She said Amos's father had done the same, walking in his time, and his father before him, and that it was simply a family responsibility passed along to the men. She used the word responsibility the way another woman might use the word inheritance. When I said, very carefully, that I had only wondered where the responsibility took him, she smiled and said, "A young wife's mind should not have to carry every errand a household requires. That is why we marry into help." She did not raise her voice once. She only listed, in a soft, warm cadence, the small habits she had noticed in me: the moved lantern, the towels folded at odd hours, the walk to the end of the porch in stocking feet. She did not accuse me of any of these things. She simply named them, and let the naming do the work. It was the first time in my life that another woman had shown me, without ever using the word watching, exactly how much watching had already been done. My hands stayed folded in my lap. Under the table, my thumbnail pressed a small crescent into the pad of my other thumb. I did not look down at it. She spoke about trust for a long time after that. She said trust was a spiritual discipline that a woman practiced by refusing to ask certain questions, in the way a farmer practiced patience by refusing to dig up a seed to see if it was growing. She said the arrangement in their family, she used that exact word, arrangement, and then paused, as if surprised at herself, was only for a season, and that a wife who could bear the season without disturbing it would be remembered kindly by everyone in the district. I heard the word remembered and understood the word rewarded. I also heard the word disturbing and understood the word punished. Both were said in the same soft voice. The contradiction of the room struck me only when I stood to leave. On every wall hung an embroidered scripture about honesty, about truthful speech, about the shame of hidden things. The entire conversation had been about what I should stop noticing. Miriam walked me to her door and set her cool, dry hand on my wrist for the length of a breath. "You are a good girl, Christina," she said. "You will do well here." She did not say if. She did not need to. I stepped down onto her porch and understood that a family authority had now personally taken an interest in what I was allowed to know, and that this interest would not go away when I closed her gate behind me. Walking home along the lane, past the orchard, past the point where Amos's lantern turned left each night, I did the only thing that felt like mine. I did not cry. I did not pray in the way I had been taught to pray, which was mostly a kind of asking to be made smaller. I stopped at the split rail fence, laid my palm flat on the top rail, and made a small, quiet decision that no one in that family had authorized. I would follow the lantern all the way this time. Not to the pines, not to the windbreak, all the way. If the arrangement was only for a season, I wanted to see, at least once with my own eyes, what a season in this house was actually made of. The chance to walk that far did not come for another 11 days. Amos's mother kept her evening schedule. Miriam sent word twice more that she hoped I would visit again when I felt rested. I did not feel rested. I felt hunted in the softest possible way, which is a strange thing to say about a house where no one ever raised a hand. What I did instead of following, in those 11 days, was watch. I watched the laundry line, because Miriam had not brought up laundry in her front room, and because a widow's household still generates sheets, and because on Tuesday and Friday mornings the extended family's washing was done at Amos's mother's house by a woman I had not yet spoken to alone. Her name was Ruth. She was the widow of Amos's first cousin Jacob, a man who had died 4 years earlier of what the family called a bad winter, which in that district meant a cause of death no one would name in front of a child. Ruth lived in the Dardy house behind Miriam's main house, in 3 small rooms with a stove that never quite warmed the far corner. She did the family's laundry 2 mornings a week in exchange for her firewood, her flour, and permission to stay where she was. I had noticed her at the wedding only because she had stood at the back of the women's line, with her hands folded low, the way a person stands when she is used to being counted last. That Friday I offered to help her. Amos's mother hesitated. I saw the calculation cross her face, the weighing of whether keeping me indoors was more important than the appearance of a new wife being kind to a widow, and then she nodded once and told me not to strain my back on the wet sheets. Ruth and I carried the basket to the long line between the smokehouse and the split rail fence. The morning was cool. The sheets were heavy with rinse water. She did not speak for the first several minutes, and I did not push her. I only pinned the sheets she handed me, in the order she handed them, and matched my breathing to hers. She began, when she began, with a question about my mother. Not a searching question, an ordinary one, about whether my mother's hands were still steady enough to quilt. I said yes. She said her own mother's had not been, at the end. Then she said, very quietly, still handing me sheets, Jacob used to walk the lane before Amos did. She did not stop the motion of her hands. She did not look at me. She pinned the next corner and reached for the next sheet, and the line of white cotton between us swung a little in the breeze. I pinned my end. My throat tightened. I did not ask her which lane. In that yard there was only one. She told me, in pieces spaced between sheets, that the walking had been in Amos's family for at least 3 generations that she knew of. She did not use the word rotation, but she described one. A man's turn began when he married, and ended when the next married man of the family was old enough to take it up. If a walker died, the turn passed sooner. If a walker's wife grew restless, the turn was sometimes shortened and given to a cousin instead. She had learned all of this the way she learned most things, not by being told, but by listening at the edges of rooms where the men forgot she was still working. Jacob had not been told he could tell her. He simply had. I asked her, as gently as I could, what had happened to her son. Ruth had had 1 child, a boy named Eli, who by the count in the district ledgers should have been 15 that year. I had not seen him at the wedding. I had not seen him at church. She pinned a pillowcase before she answered. She said Eli had begun asking, when he was 12, why his uncle walked at night, and why he had never met the person his uncle walked to see. She said the family had prayed about it. She said the following spring, arrangements had been made to send Eli to live with a distant cousin's household in a settlement 400 miles west, for schooling. He wrote to her twice a year. He had not been home since. She folded 1 sheet inside out before she hung it, and left it that way on the line. She said, without turning her head, some laundry never comes clean, Christina, if you keep turning it. Then she reached for the next basket. I understood that this was the entire warning I was going to be given, and that she had risked her firewood and her flour and her 3 small rooms to give it. I did not thank her out loud. I only handed her the next clothespin, and then the next. When the last sheet was pinned, she wiped her hands on her apron and said, in her ordinary voice, "Your husband is a kind man. He was raised inside this, the way I was raised inside my kitchen." I walked back to the house with the empty basket on my hip, my mind rearranging every conversation of the last 6 weeks. The nightly walk was not something Amos had chosen after our wedding. It was something he had inherited on the day of it. His marriage to me had not created the arrangement. It had activated his turn in it, Whoever was at the end of the lane had been receiving visitors from this family, in rotation, for longer than I had been alive, and Ruth, who was not permitted to know the destination officially, had known enough about it to lose her son to a train ticket 400 miles west. That night, I moved the lantern back to the sill exactly where it had been on the fourth night, and I put on my sturdiest shoes. I waited 3 more nights before I used the shoes. I wanted a moonless sky, and I wanted a night when Amos's mother had a reason to be at her own house instead of ours. Both conditions arrived together on a Thursday. A cousin's child in her household had a fever, and she left after supper with a jar of honey and a promise to sleep in her own bed. The sky, when I stepped out to shake the tablecloth, was the kind of black that swallows the outline of the barn. Amos noticed nothing unusual at 9:40. He kissed my forehead. He took his coat and the pail from the side door. He walked into the dark with his lantern, and I counted to 200 before I followed. I did not carry a lantern of my own. I had thought about it for days, and I had decided against it. A second light on that lane would have announced me before I reached the orchard. Instead, I wore a dark shawl over my dress, kept to the grass beside the gravel where my footfalls made no sound, and used Amos's own lantern, far ahead, as my guide. Its small orange dot rose and fell with his stride. When he paused, I paused. When he turned, I noted the turn. My eyes adjusted to the dark, the way a person's eyes adjust to a room where a candle has been blown out, slowly, and then all at once, until the pines against the sky became a shape I could read. Past the orchard, past the windbreak of pines where his lantern had disappeared each night before, the path narrowed and dipped down through a shallow hollow I had not known existed on the property. At the bottom of the hollow sat a small house. It was not a shed. It was not a barn. It was a house, low and neat, with a shingled roof and 2 small windows on the side that faced the pines, both of them lit softly from within by lamps that had been trimmed low. A short garden of late kale ran along one wall. A rain barrel stood at the corner. A path of flat stones led to the door. Someone had swept those stones recently. Amos did not knock. He lifted the latch, went inside, and left the door a few inches open behind him, because the night air was warm. I crouched behind the trunk of a fallen tree at the top of the hollow, close enough to see the shape of the front room through the crack, far enough that a person turning in the doorway would not see me. Inside, the room was clean and lived in. There was a table with a checkered cloth. There was a rocking chair with a cushion. There was a bookshelf, which I had not expected, and in the rocking chair sat a man I had never seen before in my life. An older man, grey-bearded, in a plain shirt, with his left leg propped on a low stool, and one hand curled in his lap, in a way that told me the hand no longer opened. Amos set the pail on the table, took off his hat, and knelt beside the rocking chair. He unfolded the white cloth I had glimpsed on the porch step, and used it to wipe the older man's forehead. He opened the small dark jar, and helped the older man drink something from a spoon. He lifted the older man's curled hand into his own, and rubbed it gently, the way you rub circulation back into a hand that has forgotten how to grip. Then he sat back on his heels and began to read aloud, from a book he lifted off the shelf, in a low, steady voice I had never heard him use in our own house. The older man closed his eyes and listened. I do not know how long I watched. Long enough for my knees to ache against the ground. Long enough for my whole understanding of my marriage to rearrange itself inside my chest, one piece at a time. This was not another woman. This was not a second life in the way a wife imagines second lives at 9:40 on a fourth night. This was a man being cared for, a man whose existence, if the family was going to this trouble, was a man the family had decided the district must not officially know about. Somewhere in the low, patient voice my husband was using, I began to understand who I had actually married. He was gentle in that room in a way he had never been permitted to be gentle in ours. The grief that reached me then was not the grief I had expected to feel. I had prepared, walking down that lane, for the grief of betrayal, the sharp, familiar kind, the kind a woman rehearses when she suspects her husband loves someone else, What arrived instead was quieter and worse. It was the grief of learning that my husband was capable of tenderness, and that his tenderness had already been assigned. He knelt for that older man in a way he had never knelt in our bedroom. He read aloud to that older man in a voice he had never used at our table. Whoever that man was, he had received the version of Amos I had believed the wedding would give me. I had married a placeholder. I did not stay to see Amos leave. I turned before my knees could lock, worked my way back up the hollow along the tree line, and walked home in the dark by memory instead of by his lantern. I reached our side door 20 minutes before he did. I hung my shawl on its hook. I set my sturdy shoes back in their place. I climbed the stairs to our room, and I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the folded wedding quilt at my feet. When Amos came in at 11-something, with the smell of a stranger's lamp oil in his coat, I was already lying still with my eyes closed. He kissed my forehead. He did not know that the quilt was going to become a ledger by morning. The first stitch I added went into the underside of the quilt, along the binding where my mother-in-law would never think to look. I used dark thread against dark backing, and I made the stitch small enough that it read as a flaw in the original quilting rather than a mark. One stitch for that Thursday. One more, the following night, when he left again at 9:40, as if the hollow had not been entered by a second pair of eyes. By the end of the first week, I had 8 small stitches along 1 inch of binding. By the end of the first month, I had a row that could be read only by fingertip, in the dark, by a woman who knew what she was counting. I want to be honest about what those months cost, because I do not want anyone imagining that a decision like mine came all at once. It did not. It came in the way water enters a boot, slowly, through the seam, until one morning you notice your foot has been cold for hours. I stopped writing to my mother. Her second letter had said almost exactly what her first letter said, in the same careful hand, and I understood that whatever conversation had passed between her and Amos's mother before the wedding had ended with her agreement to say nothing more. I could not accuse her without also accusing myself of having failed to hear her the first time. I lost weight, not dramatically, not enough that anyone at church would mark it, but my apron strings went around a little farther, and the small mirror over the wash basin showed a jawline I did not remember having at Willow Bend. I began praying in my own words at night, silently, while Amos was gone. The prayers I had been taught to say were mostly requests to be made softer, more patient, more content with the portion I had been given. The prayers I began saying instead were not requests at all. They were sentences. I see what I see. I know what I know. Do not let me forget either one. I said them in the same voice a person uses to steady a horse. During the day, I became a better wife than I had been in my first month. I moved through the house with a calm I did not feel. I answered Amos's mother's questions with warmth. I helped Miriam preserve pears in her back kitchen without once looking toward the lane. I complimented Lena's needlework and did not glance at the side door when its latch lifted for a chore. If they were watching me for signs of disturbance, I gave them a wife too settled to require watching. My compliance during daylight bought me the small freedoms of dusk, a walk to the mailbox alone, an hour in the garden without company, and I spent those freedoms on the quilt. Amos changed too, in the way a man changes when he senses a fence has been mended without him. He became gentler with me in small, negotiating ways. He brought in kindling I had not asked for. He fixed the loose board on the second stair before I mentioned it. Once at supper, he laid his hand over mine on the table for the length of a breath, and did not look at his mother when he did it. I understood then that some part of him was trying to give me what he could give, which was not the truth, and not his evenings, and not the version of himself that knelt in the hollow, but a kind of daylight kindness offered as payment on a debt he could not name. Winter came in early that year. The lane froze into hard ruts. Amos's lantern still went out at 9:40. The pines took on a coating of white that made them easier to see against the sky, which meant it became harder for me to follow, and I did not try again. I did not need to. I had seen the hollow once. What I needed now was information about the shape of the arrangement, and information came slowly, in the way information comes to a woman who has learned to listen while she peels apples. Ruth, at the laundry line, gave me a little more each Friday, always inside sentences that could be denied afterward if anyone asked. In February, Amos told me, on a Sunday afternoon, while we walked back from a family dinner at Miriam's house, that the season was almost over. He said it with the tone of a man delivering good news carefully, in case the good news might frighten his wife. He said soon the walks would stop, and we could begin our life together in earnest, and perhaps in the spring we might think about the sort of things young couples think about in the spring. I nodded. I let him take my mittened hand for the length of a field. I did not tell him that 2 nights earlier, coming down the stairs in stocking feet for a glass of water, I had heard Miriam in the kitchen telling a younger nephew of hers that he would begin his own turn in April. That was the sentence that finished something inside me. It did not shatter it. It did not even bruise it. It simply set it down, gently, on a shelf where I could no longer pretend not to see it. The arrangement was not a season. It was a rotation. When Amos's turn ended, it would pass to the next married man in the family, and the next quiet bride would move a lantern 1 inch on a sill she did not yet own. The hollow would be swept, the rocking chair would be dusted, the pail would be handed over, and somewhere, in the linen chest of another young woman 2 counties from here, another wedding quilt would be folded at the foot of another bed, waiting to become a ledger. I began, that night, to plan what a wife who refused to hand the pail forward would actually have to do. The pressure to become a mother arrived the way most pressure arrived in that house, through kindness and through tea. Miriam invited me over on a bright March afternoon when the snow was going soft under the eaves. She had baked a shoofly pie. She poured our cups herself. She asked about my sisters in Willow Bend, and listened to my answers as if she had never asked before. Then, in the same warm tone, she said that a child would be a great settling gift for a young wife, and that she and Amos's mother had been praying for one since the wedding. She said it the way an accountant closes a ledger, softly, without ceremony, as if the total had already been agreed. I understood the arithmetic immediately. A pregnant wife would not walk to the end of a lane in the dark. A nursing mother would not sit up counting 940s. A woman with a baby at her hip would have no free hand for a lantern. Miriam did not need to say any of that. She only needed to name the wish, and to name it in a room where 2 cups of tea were already poured. Amos's mother repeated the wish that same evening, more tenderly, cupping my face for a moment at the door, and calling me daughter for the first time since the wedding. 3 days later, a letter arrived from my own mother in Willow Bend, in her small, even hand, saying she thought it was time. That letter was the sentence I could not forgive, not because my mother had written it, but because the timing of it made clear that Amos's mother had asked her to. My own mother's hand had been used, from 4 counties away, to press me toward a pregnancy whose purpose in that household would not be a child in the ordinary sense. It would be a lock. I sat with her letter on the edge of the bed for a long time that evening. Then I folded it once, slid it under the wedding quilt with the small row of stitches, and understood that I was going to have to make a decision that would cost me every letter my mother would ever write me again. The next Friday, at the laundry line, Ruth handed me a pillowcase and, inside its folded edge, an envelope. She did not look at me as she passed it. She only said, without breaking the rhythm of her pinning, "There is a woman in Millersburg who takes in wives who need to sit a while." Inside the envelope were 3 $10 bills, a folded slip of paper with a name and a road number, and a single line in Ruth's careful print. "Bus leaves the feed store at 6:40. Ask for Elizabeth." I understood what that envelope had cost her. She had bought her firewood and her 3 small rooms with silence for 4 years, and she was breaking the silence for me. Amos knew something had shifted in me before I said a word. He came in on a Tuesday evening, an evening he was not supposed to be home, and sat down on the edge of our bed while I was folding a stack of towels. He asked me, quietly, if I would promise him one thing. He asked me to promise that I would never walk to the end of the lane, not once, not for any reason, for as long as we were married. He said if I could promise him that, he would ask his mother to share the evening chores with me differently, and Miriam to give me back the tin box from the pantry, and even a small share in the family's evening duties, whatever that meant, as if any of those things were his to offer. I looked at my husband then in a way I had not looked at him since the 4th night of our marriage. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had been trained, from boyhood, to carry a weight he had never been asked whether he wanted, and to hand that weight forward when his time was done. He had knelt in the hollow. He had read aloud to a man the district pretended did not exist. He had been gentle inside that small, clean room in a way our own bedroom had never been allowed to hold. I loved him a little, in a very tired way, in that moment. And I told him no. I told him I could not promise a thing I had already broken. I told him I had walked to the end of the lane in October. I told him I had seen the hollow, and the rocking chair, and the older man with the curled hand. I did not name the man. I did not need to. Amos's face did not change all at once. It changed the way a field changes when a shadow crosses it. He looked down at his boots. He looked at the folded quilt at the foot of our bed. He asked me, very quietly, if I had told anyone. I said no. He asked me if I intended to. I said I did not know yet. He sat with his hands on his knees for a long time. Then he did something he had not done since our wedding night. He did not leave at 9:40. He stayed. He stayed the next night too, and the night after that. His mother noticed by the 3rd evening. Miriam noticed by the 4th. On the 5th day, Amos's mother came by in the morning with a basket of jars and a soft voice, and told me that perhaps I should go home to Willow Bend for a little while, just until my nerves settled, just until the spring air came in properly. She said it the way a woman announces a decision that has already been made in another room. I asked when. She said the driver would come Tuesday. I said I would pack a small trunk. She kissed my forehead, the way Amos had kissed it on the 4th night, and left the basket on the counter. I sat down at the kitchen table with the envelope from Ruth in my apron pocket, and I understood that the arrangement had just chosen its own way of removing me. Part 10. The driver came on Tuesday morning at 9, in the same hired van that had once brought Amos's mother to our Willow Bend kitchen with a plate of good manners. I had packed a small trunk with the clothes I had brought from home a year before, my mother's letters, and, at the bottom, folded into a pillowcase, the wedding quilt with its private row of stitches along the binding. Amos's mother watched me set the trunk on the porch. She did not ask what was inside it. Miriam did not come to see me off. Amos carried the trunk to the van himself, set it in the back, and stood with his hands loose at his sides. He said, very quietly, "Write when you are settled." He meant it, and he did not. I did not go to Willow Bend. I asked the driver, a kind English man named Dale, who had driven for plain families for 30 years, to take me instead to the feed store in Millersburg. He looked at me for one steady moment in the rearview mirror, understood everything he needed to understand, and did not ask a single question. He drove me the extra 11 miles. He carried my trunk to the bench outside the store himself. He wished me well in the plain way English men wish plain women well, when they suspect it may be the last kindness those women receive that day. The bus came at 6:40. Elizabeth, the Mennonite woman whose name Ruth had given me, was waiting at the other end. I stayed with Elizabeth in a small house on the edge of a small town for the better part of 18 months. She had done this before, for other women, and she did not treat me as a story. She gave me a room with a bed and a window, work in her greenhouse that paid a little cash each week, and the address of a plain dress bakery 2 streets over that was looking for morning help. She did not ask me what I had seen at the end of a lane. She only asked, on my 3rd evening, whether I wanted her to write to my mother on my behalf. I said not yet. It would be 4 months before I said yes, and another 2 before my mother answered. Word came back from Amos's district in pieces. Through Ruth, through Dale, through a cousin of a cousin who ran produce to the same auction. Amos did not come after me. His mother told the district that I had gone home to help my own mother with a difficult season, and that my nerves had not been strong enough for a first year of marriage. Miriam agreed, in front of the deacon's wife, that these things happen sometimes to girls from smaller settlements. No formal shunning was pronounced against me, because I had not been formally accused of anything. The marriage was spoken of, when it was spoken of at all, as difficult, which in that district meant a door that would be left ajar for 18 months, and then quietly closed. What did not stop was the rotation. In April, exactly as Miriam had told her younger nephew in the kitchen the night I overheard her, the walks passed to Amos's cousin Daniel, who had married a quiet girl from a settlement in Indiana at the end of March. I never met her. Ruth wrote to me, once, on a small square of paper folded inside a seed catalogue, to tell me only that the new bride's lantern sat on a different sill in a different upstairs room, and that she seemed very settled. Ruth herself was moved that summer from the Dardy house behind Miriam's house to a smaller one at the back of the property, farther from the road. Her firewood, she wrote, was still delivered. Her son Eli, 400 miles west, still wrote twice a year. The older man in the hollow was, I learned much later, Amos's uncle Isaac, his father's younger brother, who had left the faith briefly as a young man, gone to work in a nearby town, been struck by a truck at a crossing, and come back to his family unable to use his left hand or walk without help. To acknowledge Isaac publicly would have meant acknowledging that he had left. To place him in a nursing home would have meant that English strangers would have signed his papers, seen his records, learned the family's business. So Isaac lived in the hollow. Married men of the family took turns caring for him at 9:40 each night, because that was the hour after the district went to bed, and before the road got quiet enough for a stranger to notice a light in the pines. The final piece took me the longest to accept. My father, at the end of his life, in a letter Elizabeth held for me, until I was ready to open it, wrote 3 careful sentences about the wedding. He wrote that Amos's mother had told him, before the match was agreed to, that the family had a private care matter that the boys of the household attended to, and that a wife from a smaller settlement, far enough away not to know the family's history, would be a mercy to them. My father wrote that he had believed care meant an aunt with dementia, or a cousin with an illness. He wrote that he had never asked which. He wrote that he was sorry. That was the last letter I ever received from him. I opened the trunk one evening in Elizabeth's spare room, months after I arrived, and laid the wedding quilt on the bed. The row of small dark stitches along the binding had grown longer than I remembered. I counted them once, and then I did not count them again. The quilt was never a symbol of a marriage waiting to begin. It was the record of a marriage that had been designed, from before the wedding, never to fully begin. A folded rectangle at the foot of a bed, whose real purpose was to make the bed look occupied, while a husband walked to a hollow to care for a man the district had agreed to forget. I refolded it that night, corners square, and set it back in the trunk. I have never undone a single stitch.